Hi everyone, my name is Amanda Grev. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist with University of Maryland Extension, and today we're here at the Western Maryland Research and Education Center, or WMREC, to do a little bit of education and video filming on grazing techniques and grazing management. And I'm going to be kind of showing you all today a little bit about the things that we're doing here at the Research Center, give you some ideas and thoughts on different techniques, different ways to accomplish rotational grazing, different grazing management strategies, what some of the different terminologies mean there for the different grazing strategies. Here at the WMREC Research Center, we currently have a project that's focused on different grazing strategies to boost season-long production. So we know that oftentimes grazing is a more economical source of forage for our livestock compared to purchasing or even sometimes growing our own supplemented or stored feed. So a lot of producers are really interested in extending their grazing, providing more high quality forage for a longer time throughout the year. So here we have one of two herds right now. The treatment that we're standing in is a cool season perennial based forage system. So all of the pastures that this group of animals is grazing are cool season perennial pastures. It's a mixed stand with some orchard grass, tall fescue, a little bit of Kentucky bluegrass, some red clover, white clover, etc. Very common forages that we see in this kind of mid-Atlantic region. And our goal for this group is to just maximize the amount of production we get from this cool season perennial stand. The other group, which we'll visit in a little while, is an integrated system that uses cool season perennials and also some warm and cool season annuals mixed in to really try to have a longer grazing season and produce more high quality forage during the heat of the summer or in the early spring or late fall when our cool season production has slowed. So we'll see that group in a little while. Right now they're on the summer annual pasture. It's early August, first week of August right now. So they've been grazing the summer annuals for about a month and we'll eventually be moving to winter annuals. And our goal with this project is really to compare these two groups in terms of forage production, forage quality, animal performance. So you can see we have mixed species herd or flurd, if you will, here of sheep and cattle. And these are younger growing animals. So we're trying to put a lot of growth and weight gain on them. And so we're weighing and measuring them every other week. So we're tracking their body condition score, their weight gain, their health and disease pressure, looking at like parasite pressure for the sheep especially, but for both species. And just looking at both the forage aspects and the animal aspects in those cool season only or integrated warm season annual, cool season perennial system. All right, so before we kind of get into the different techniques and different grazing management systems, I wanted to emphasize that we're going to show you a lot of different examples here today, but just keep in mind that when it comes to grazing management, there are a million different ways to accomplish the same goal, right? So I encourage everybody, if you're looking to improve your grazing management system or you're looking to get started with some sort of grazing management system, to really think about your goals, think about your resources. Remember that there's going to be no one-size-fits-all system. So what works best for us here at the Research Center or for your neighbor across the road is not necessarily going to be what works best for you. So keep in mind that flexibility is key. We're going to show you a lot of different examples and different options and talk a little bit about what works best for us here. But again, remember that not everything is going to be perfect for everyone, and you just keep that in mind and try to stay flexible as you kind of go forward with altering your grazing management. All right, so one of the first things to keep in mind when it comes to grazing management is we can have undergrazing or overgrazing in a given pasture. And we'll show you guys some examples of what those might look like. But in an undergrazing situation, we're typically going to have really uneven utilization of the forage in a field. So some areas are going to be grazed, some areas are going to be left ungrazed. And this may lead to pretty good animal performance. The animals are eating the high quality, the best forages that they can select from that field. but we're really not utilizing that field as much as we could be. And in the context of trying to, extend the grazing season and maximize forage production, we're basically underutilizing our resources. And eventually, sometimes those spots that they go back to and graze repeatedly over and over again may start to be a little bit overgrazed, while other areas of the field start to grow and get a little bit more stemmy and more mature and are even more underutilized. So we don't want to be underutilizing our forages, but at the same time, we don't want to be overutilizing them or overgrazing them. And more people are familiar with what the term overgrazing means, but essentially in an overgraze situation, we're exceeding the maximum capacity of a forage, and our forage growth is not able to keep up with our animal demand. So we're continuously overusing those resources. Eventually, the energy reserves of the plants are going to be depleted. Those plants are not going to be able to persist. They're not going to be able to continue to grow. We may start to see erosion and other things like that start to occur. So really, when it comes to grazing management, it's all about finding a balance where we're not underutilizing forage, but we're not overutilizing it and leading to more overgrazing. So we're trying to find that sweet spot or that happy medium where we're achieving a good balance between those two terms. I wanted to touch just briefly on a couple of terms that we use a lot in the grazing industry. So the first is kind of calculating our stocking rate or stocking density. In order to do that, we have to know how many animal units we have. And essentially, an animal unit is standardized to 1,000 pounds of whatever species we're working with. So a 1,000-pound cow would be one animal unit. If we had 10 100-pound lambs, those would be one animal unit as a group. So essentially, one animal unit is 1,000 pounds. And once we have our animal unit, we can use that to calculate both our stocking rate and our stocking density. So stocking rate is essentially the entire acreage on a farm versus the amount of livestock or animals on that farm. So for this example, at the research center, we have about 25 acres of pasture total between the perennials and the annuals all combined. And we have about 17 animal units, counting up all of our sheep and cows in each of our herds. And when you do the math on that, it comes out to about 1.5 animal units per acre for our stocking rate for this farm, for all of our area. And people always ask, well, what's the perfect or the most ideal stocking rate to have on a farm? Well, that depends a lot on what forages you're growing, how productive those forages are, how intensively or less intensively you're managing that system. But we can see stocking rates as low as, 1.5 animal units per acre, or up to even 5 animal units per acre, just depending on the productivity of that area. If you think, out west, where they have more rangeland that doesn't produce as much due to the lower rainfall, they have even higher stocking rates on their land out there. So there's a really wide range in stocking rates that we see in the grazing industry. So the difference between that and stocking density is calculated at a given moment in time. So it would be the amount of animal units on the acreage that the animals are currently in. So for example, if we take one of our groups of animals, which would be half of our stocking rate. So I said we have 17 animal units, so that's 8.5 animal units in one of our herds. And we say they're on a pasture that's about 0.4 acres. That gives us a stocking density of 0.05 acres per animal unit. So it's obviously a much smaller number because the animals are only on a small area at any given time. And again, the range for this can fluctuate depending on your management, how big of pastures or paddocks you're using, a lot of different things. But it's important to remember that, stocking rate is kind of looking at the whole season or the whole year, the whole farm. And stocking density is looking at the amount of pounds on a given unit of land at a single point in time. So they can be calculated a little bit differently, but both using the same kind of concept. So the goal of calculating these stocking rates or stocking densities are to give you an idea of not only how many animals your pastures can support or sustain, but also trying to figure out how they're doing over time. So if you're doing a good job with your grazing management, you're producing more forages, you're increasing the capacity of production on your land base, then hopefully you can increase your stocking rate and use that same land base to support more animals. So you can, be more productive on your given land base. So that's one way we can use stocking rates. We can also use them to compare, different forage types. So maybe we can have a higher stocking density on these annual forages in the summer months when they're really productive and they're thriving in this hot, dry weather, versus our cool season pastures. We need a little bit lower stocking density because they're going through the summer slump and they're not growing quite as fast. So we can adjust our stocking rates and stocking densities according to our forage growth to try to match our stocking rate with our forage production to really hit that sweet spot in grazing management. All right, so one of the options for kind of grazing management strategies would be a continuous grazing system. And essentially what that means is that animals have access to the entire pasture or the entire field at all times. And they can decide where they want to be, they can decide what plants they want to graze, um, and they can go wherever they would like. And in some cases, if you're really understocked, this might work. But again, we're trying to utilize our forage to the best that we can and to really maximize our use from every acre, especially here in the Mid-Atlantic where we have a small land base and land is pretty expensive. We want to try to make the most of all of the acres that we have. So a continuous system, in some cases might work, but we're trying to kind of steer away from that more towards a managed grazing system. And we'll talk about what some of those different options might look like for, rotational grazing or strip grazing or things like that. But I wanted to show you an example first of what something might end up looking like in a continuous grazing system. So I'm actually standing in our alleyway or laneway here at the research center. And this area, because it's a laneway, it gets used a lot more heavily than our pastures that we're rotating through, because the animals have access to it a lot more often. And so we can use this as an example of what a continuous grazing system might look like. The reason that you see very little forage growth around me is that the animals can come through here and repeatedly graze these forages over and over again. It's not offering them a rest period that those forages need to regrow and replenish their energy reserves. So you can see as a result, we have a really short forage growth. We have not a lot of good grass or desirable forage species here. We have some weed encroachment, things like horse nettle, foxtail, or other weeds that are more undesirable can start to encroach and start to fill in some of those bare areas that are left as our field is overgrazed. So oftentimes in a continuous grazing system, animals tend to return to the same area and continue eating the forages that they like over and over again. And they've shown on average that an area can be, or a plant can be regrazed as little as every 2 to 7 days, which is really hard on the plants. So like I said, the good plants that we see start to go away. And this will really affect our longevity of our field because the good plants are not going to be able to keep up and eventually are going to die off. And we're going to see more and more of bare soil, empty patches, or weed encroachment like we see here. So ideally, we want to try to avoid a continuously grazed pasture system, and we can accomplish that in a variety of different ways, which we'll talk about, rotational grazing, strip grazing, different things like that, and we'll show you some examples of how we might accomplish that. So one of the other disadvantages in a continuous graze system, in addition to like persistence and loss of desirable plants, is we're having less efficiency or less utilization of the pasture as a whole. Like I mentioned, our goal a lot of times with grazing management is to try to boost productivity and overall forage production. And in a continuously grazed system where animals return to the same areas over and over and continue to graze those same spots, they often let other areas go underutilized or ungrazed. And we start to see, buildup of more stemmy material, plants that the animals won't eat as they get more mature and they put on a seed head, weedy areas or weedy patches. And this really decreases our overall efficiency or utilization in that given field. So on average, in a continuously grazed system, we might only be looking at 30 or 40% of that field that's actually being grazed or utilized by the animals. And keep that number in mind, and we'll contrast it with more of the rotational systems and see how we can boost our utilization or our efficiency. So one of the first options for grazing management is rotational grazing, and that can kind of mean a whole variety of different things. But essentially, rotational grazing is simply subdividing your entire pasture area into multiple different paddocks and rotating animals sequentially between those different paddocks. And we'll talk in a minute about maybe how to decide when to move animals or when a pasture is ready to be rotated in or out of. But I wanted to show an example of kind of what that setup might look like. So behind me, you can see one large field, and here we have our perimeter or exterior fence for this field. And we have this field subdivided into about 5 different paddocks using a temporary fence or electric netting. So you can see kind of the white netting behind me. And so this would be an example of a rotational grazing system where animals are moved from paddock to paddock through these fields as the forage is ready to be rotated or moved. The advantages of doing this type of system compared to what we just talked about in the continuously grazed system are when animals are moved out of a given field, then the field that they just left has time to rest and regrow, and the forages in that field have time to regenerate their energy reserves replenish their energy supply before the next grazing. We typically get less open areas, less bare space. We'll be less prone to soil erosion in this type of situation because we're keeping good ground cover across the whole field as we're moving animals through that field. We often see less encroachment of weeds or other things that start to fill in because, again, we're keeping that good canopy, we're keeping that ground cover maintained. And in general, all of this put together leads to a better management system in terms of forage growth. Because those forages are more productive and healthier, we're building better soil, we're building up the health of our soil, we're having more healthy roots down in that soil. We're increasing our productivity in that field because forages will be healthy and happy, if you will, and able to produce more throughout the growing season. In a rotational grazing system, this can be as little as 2 pastures that you rotate back and forth in between, or as many as 100 or more pastures that you rotate between. Again, flexibility is really key in these grazing management systems, and you want to figure out kind of the balance that works best for you. Here at the research station, we do a combination of rotation and more of a frontal grazing, which we'll explain here in a little bit. But we have about 10, in this part of the field, about 10 larger paddocks that we rotate between that we're moving animals through. And oftentimes in a more simple rotation system, say, 4 to maybe 10 pastures, we'll get an increase in that efficiency that we talked about. So we'll get maybe a 50 to 60% utilization. As we make the paddocks smaller and move animals more frequently, we start to build that utilization and increase that efficiency. And we'll see that we can increase that up to more like 60 or 70% utilization of that field. So animals are grazing that field a little bit more evenly. We're getting more, even grazing, more even regrowth, and just starting to really boost the productivity of that field. So again, start simple, start small, keep it easy for yourself, but as you get used to it, you may find that you see more advantages with further subdividing or making pastures a little bit smaller and increasing that rotation. In addition to rotational grazing, there's a lot of different types, like I said, of grazing management systems. And here at the research station, we use a little bit of rotational grazing, which you saw with like the larger netting subdivisions, but we also do what we refer to as like a strip or frontal grazing. So in a strip grazing situation, this wire or this hot fence that you see Here, we would be moving it along and giving them essentially a new strip or a new section of ungrazed pasture. And really, people use strip and frontal grazing kind of interchangeably. Technically, strip grazing is giving them a new strip and having a back fence up so they can't go back to the area that they just were in. In a frontal grazing situation, which is more of what we do, they're given a new strip, but the back fence is not put up. So they could still go back onto the area where they already grazed. Here, we use more of the frontal type grazing simply because our water source is at the other end of these paddocks. And so we want them to be able to go back to water, back to shade, and still have access to those resources while still allotting them a new section of pasture. And so one of the reasons we use this in combination with rotational grazing is we really increase our overall utilization of the forage. So they're given access to a smaller area. They graze that area more uniformly, more evenly, before we give them access to the new or the next section. And we talked a little bit about different utilizations. In strip grazing, you can really get some of the highest utilization. So think, up 70, 80%, because you're just giving them a little bit of new forage at a time. So you're really making them utilize all of the existing forage a lot more evenly. And for us, this works really well. Even though we don't have a back fence up, the animals tend to prefer to be in the new section. You can see they're all right here waiting. They know, they're ready to be moved. They want to be moved and have access to their new section. And they don't tend to go back and regraze a lot on the sections that they have access to still, but have already grazed. They prefer to be where the new and the better forage is. So this works really well. Like I said, we use it in combination with rotation. So we have each of our larger rotational grazed fields divided typically into thirds. So we give them a third of the section and then another third and then another third before we move them into the next larger pasture. And it works pretty well for us. Typically, the smaller sections, I think are about, 0.4, 0.5 acres here. And we allow them to have about 2 days of grazing, depending on forage growth and how fast things are growing and how fast we want to be moving animals through the pastures. But usually they're in a section for about 2 days here before we kind of move them on to the next section. But again, flexibility is key, right? You can be doing moves every hour. You can be doing moves a couple times a day. You can be doing moves, every few days or once a week. You really have to kind of decide what works for you and for your system. So yeah, that's the difference really between kind of the strip or frontal grazing and the rotational grazing. And like everything, we can use a lot of these different things in combination with each other and kind of tweak our management accordingly. All right, so one other type of grazing that is an option that's commonly referred to by various people and pretty routinely done in the industry is called mob grazing. We don't really utilize that a lot here at the research farm, but I just briefly wanted to explain maybe what mob grazing is or what it would look like. So essentially, mob grazing is where we're consolidating our herd of animals into a really small area. So we have really high density of animals on a small area of land. And so as an example, if I were to take this mixed species herd behind me and do some mob grazing with them, essentially I would need to contain them on less than 1/10 of an acre to really get a high trampling effect and a high stock density on a small given area. And the reason people do this is to really provide some animal impact on the soil, whether that's to trample in some fresh organic matter in the soil, whether that's to use the high animal density to provide a lot of nutrients in a small area of land, whether that's to really promote kind of an even grazing utilization or trample in some undesirable forage species. There's a variety of reasons why you might employ mob grazing, and you don't have to do it all the time. You can do it in certain circumstances or for a short amount of time or in a field where you want to provide that high animal impact for a short period of time. But the key is we're providing a really high animal impact for a short amount of time and then providing that area a long rest period so that those plants can really recover and regrow and rejuvenate after that really high intensity grazing. So that's what mob grazing would look like. Again, I don't have a really good example here, but if we were to concentrate this group of animals in a really small area, we could effectively do some mob grazing here. All right, so one of the common questions that we get asked a lot for rotational grazing is, how do I know when I should move my animals into the next field? Or how do I know when I need to take animals out of the field that I've been grazing? So this pasture was just grazed by our animals who you saw earlier. Let's see, about a week ago probably. So it has a little bit of regrowth starting now, but I wanted to use it as an example of when we might want to move animals out of a field. So the real answer to that question is going to depend a little bit on what forages you have growing in a field. Like I said earlier, here we have a lot of orchard grass, tall fescue, a lot of the cool season perennials. And on average, we like to see a residual or an amount of plant material left in the field of at least 3 or 4 inches at the minimum. I personally prefer, especially during the heat of the summer, to leave a little bit more of extra forage in the field, maybe more like a 5 or 6 inch residual. And so if you're, trying to debate or see when you can move animals out of a field, you can use a grazing stick or a yardstick or any other, measuring device if you're unsure. And you want to walk around through that field and kind of see how much forage is left. And if we look here, we have, about maybe 6 inches or so of residual left in this spot. Again, you're going to want to look at the whole field, not just one particular place. You want to walk, throughout the whole field, kind of see on average how much residual you have left. And you want to, measure that spot. You want to look at, have the tops of the grasses been grazed off, but you still have some leaf material remaining. And then that's how you can kind of determine that a field is ready to be done grazing and start being rested. One other handy tool that I like to kind of show people, because it's easy to remember and we don't always have a grazing stick or a yardstick with us, is if you have a coffee cup or a water bottle or something like that. Oftentimes when you turn these things on their side, they're about 3 or 4 inches wide. And so if we kind of lay our coffee cup in the grass and the grass is down below the side of that coffee cup, we know we have probably met our minimum residual height and we want to be moving those animals off of that field. So that's kind of just a fun little trick or easy way to see when we should be moving animals out of a field. So like I said, the animals left this field about a week ago. We have a nice amount of residual here. These, remaining leaf material is going to be shading the surface of this soil so that we're keeping the soil cool during these hot, summer days and promoting a rapid regrowth from these forages moving forward. So we just showed an example of a pasture that would be ready to move animals out of and ready to be rested. Here is an example of a pasture that we could move the animals into or that would be ready for grazing. So again, if we take our grazing stick or our measuring device, you can see that on average, the canopy here is up to 12 or 13 inches. So we have a good amount of forage here that would be available for grazing. We have a mix of legumes and grasses here in this section. Again, if you want to use your cup to measure, if I put my cup down in here, standing upright, the forage is plenty, a lot taller than the cup. We can't even see it. So this would be a good indication that a field would be ready to start being grazed, and we could turn the animals in whenever we were ready to graze it. All right, so one of the things when you're thinking about putting together a grazing system and like kind of designing how you want to do it is thinking about ease of movement for the animals and how you're going to move animals from pasture to pasture if you're implementing some sort of rotational grazing system. So we'll use this as an example. You can see behind me, I'm standing in a central laneway that runs all the way down the length of this field between our two main fields for our perennial system. And you can see that I have gates going off of both sides behind me, to my right and to my left. And there are gates staggered down this laneway on both sides that provide access to the different pastures. So having a central laneway can make it really easy to move animals from field to field simply by shutting one gate behind them and opening another gate and allowing them access into a new field. So that can be a really easy way to move animals from field to field. That's on the pro side. On the con side, sometimes an alleyway can be an area that tends to be a little bit more heavily abused, can be a little bit more overgrazed and prone to things like erosion, weed encroachment. We do see a little bit of that here in our central laneway. It also, if you're having parasite issues at all, especially with your small ruminants, can be a source of like a hotbed for parasites for the small ruminants. So something to keep in mind, but it is an option for a really easy way to move animals to different pastures and to and from, say, a handling system if you need to treat animals when they're sick or have a foot problem or anything like that. So there are lots of ways to move animals around. Laneway is just one example, and it is one that we use here for this group at least in this perennial pasture system. So for this group of animals that's on the annual side right now, you can see we don't really have a laneway in this field. The field is subdivided, as you can see some of the fencing behind me, in a bunch of different pastures that we're using for rotational grazing, but we don't have a central laneway or an easy way to move animals from pasture to pasture. So when you're thinking about, system design and how you're going to put together your rotational grazing system, one of the things that's important to think about is animal handling or movement. How are you going to bring animals in if you have, a deworming that you need to do, or if you have some sort of health issue that you need to treat on an animal? You have to be thinking about how you're going to move animals through your system. So what we do on this side, where we don't have the central laneway, is we sort of use our temporary fencing to make a temporary laneway that we can use to move animals from field to field. We're also somewhat strategic on how we move animals through this field. So, we try not to move them all the way across and then go from one end all the way to the other. We try to make more of a circular shape with our pastures so that they can follow more of the flow from pasture to pasture and not be trying to go across long stretches without an easy way to get them there. So again, like with everything in the grazing world, there's a lot of different ways we can accomplish this. And you can make a lot of different things work. You just have to be flexible and, get good at being creative and thinking about how you're going to move animals through that system as a whole. All right, so one of the biggest limitations in setting up a rotational grazing system is providing access to water at all points of the field. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. Here at the research station, we use a couple of different strategies to provide water to the different groups. On this part of the field, we actually have a pre-existing buried water line that runs along both sides of our field and has 6 different quick connect points where we can directly hook into the buried water line. So this is really nice because it provides us different watering points that we can use to access multiple different pastures. So I can use this watering point to access the pasture to my left. I can also use it to access the pasture over here to the right. And I can just move the watering trough around, hooked to this buried water line here. And it makes it really easy to connect it. So we have these quick connect things that you can hook right into the ground system. Very simple and easy. So I'll hook this in. And just like that, we're tapped into the water line and connected and able to be filling our water trough. So having these different watering access points not only allows us to provide water to different pastures, it also allows us to bring the water a little bit closer to where the animals are grazing. So in a perfect world, we would like to have a water supply within less than 800 or 900 feet from where the animals are grazing. This is simply because it allows for more even grazing distribution and even grazing pressure in the pasture that they're grazing in. And it prevents them from moving as a herd and traveling as a big group back to the water source. They've shown that, if animals are grazing within that 800 or so feet from a water source, they'll just go individually and take a drink as they need to. Versus if water is further than that away from where they're grazing, they will all travel as a group to the water system, might end up hanging out there, congregating there, depositing extra nutrients there before eventually making their way back into the field. So in a perfect world, we'd be providing water in each of our different fields and moving that around with the animals so that they have that constant access to clean, fresh water, and that it's nearby enough that they're not, halting grazing to go take a drink as a group from the water source. So they have access nearby, and it really helps make grazing a little bit more even. We're able to utilize the forage in that field a little bit better and accomplish more of those goals. When you're in a grazing system, there's also a lot of options for watering systems and providing water. And providing water can be one of the biggest challenges, especially when you're getting into rotational grazing and moving animals more often to different pastures. It can be a little bit of a challenge to have a good access to clean, fresh water in all of those different rotations. And so, again, there's a lot of ways to accomplish this. Here at the research station, we use a couple different options for watering systems. You can see behind me, I have this hose, which is literally manually filling up this black water trough. So manually coming out and filling up a watering trough with a hose is always one option. The other trough that you see here has an automatic watering system in it. So I'll hook it up here in a second, but on the inside of this, we have a float valve, and we connect it here on this quick connect on the outside. And then this one automatically fills up and stays full for the animals versus manually having to be refilled every day. So we kind of use this black trough as our backup, especially during these hot summer months when things are really hot and dry. We want to make sure that we always have plenty of fresh access to water. So this is kind of our backup or our reserve. And then we have this one here. So I'll hook this up. It's fairly straightforward. We have a little quick connect attached here on the end so we can easily connect and unconnect it. And then I'll turn the water on, and you can see that it's starting to fill here. And we'll show you in a second, once it's full, how this, when this float comes up, essentially it shuts the water off. So when the water rises to the point that the float is at the top, the water will shut off. And so this one will stay full no matter what. And then this one we just manually fill as needed. So two different options for watering systems that we use here. There are also, again, like I said, a lot of other options as well, but it's really important to be providing our animals with 24/7 access to fresh, clean water, especially when it's really hot, but really at all times of the year. All right, so there are a lot of different options when it comes to providing shade for livestock on pasture. One example is natural shade from trees. So you can see behind me, obviously, a lot of the trees that we are blessed with in one of our fields here at the research center. This was planted long before my time here at the university, but it provides a really nice natural source of shade for when the livestock are grazing the adjacent fields next to it. So we usually give them access to this nice wooded area along with the pasture right next to it so they can use that for grazing and come back to this area for shade to rest. Technically this was established as a silvopasture area. I hesitate a little bit to call it that at this point, only because this was never really properly thinned to make it a true silvopasture. So in a perfect world, these trees would be thinned out a little bit more so that we would get more sunlight through the canopy, and we would have better forage growth underneath, and we would be able to use this as more of a true pasture. right now, there's green ground cover underneath, but it's a lot of the shade loving species that aren't really as good for grazing, things like Japanese stilt grass and other things like that, that animals don't graze quite as readily. So we actually have plans to thin this stand and make it a real true silvopasture. But for now, it actually works really well as a good shade source while animals are grazing the fields next to it. So one really great option if you have it is using trees for shade. All right, so I'm standing in another option that we can use for shade and that we do use for shade part of the time here at the research station. This is a large structure, an open-sided structure that has our handling system for the cattle and the sheep in it, but we also have this open area here in the middle. And when the animals are in some of these front pastures that are behind me, we give them access to the interior of this building as a place for them to come in and get shade. So if you have, a three-sided structure or an open-sided structure of any sort, regardless of the size, that can be another option for utilizing as a shade source for livestock to use, again, during the heat of the summer, during those hot summer months. So behind me, you can see that other group of animals that I referenced to at the beginning. This is the animals that are in the integrated annual pasture, perennial pasture system. And like I mentioned, right now they're grazing on a variety of different warm season annuals. So, it's a little hard to tell from here, but behind me we have a number of different mixes of warm season annuals that these animals are grazing and have access to. And again, we're looking at the forage production and the animal performance when we're integrating these annual forages into this forage system. So part of implementing a rotational grazing system oftentimes means using temporary fencing tools and supplies to help you subdivide your pasture into smaller areas to then rotate your animals around. And this is not an all encompassing supply source by any means. But here we just have a few different examples of different fence posts or different things you can use to help subdivide your fields a little bit. So there's a wide range in post options. Some of them, like these taller ones, are a little bit taller in height, a little bit thicker or sturdier around in diameter. They oftentimes come with these different clips that you can move to different grazing heights based on what animals you're using. You can add multiple clips if you have multiple species, like for example here where we have the sheep and the cattle. We often are running 2 or even 3 fence wires, so we would have 2 or 3 of these clips at different heights. These ones over here are more of what we call drivable posts. So we would use a little hammer or something to pound these into the ground a little bit as needed, versus these ones are more of a step in type of post. For example, you can see a lot of them have this little foot peg down here in the bottom, so you can easily just use your foot and step that into the ground. These again come in a variety of different options. So, there's different spacings for your wires. There's different groupings. There's different options for connections. Some are more fiberglass material. Some are more plastic material. These are kind of the more traditional pigtail posts, if you will. This one's probably a little bit less used because it gives you a lot less options in terms of wire height, right? You really just have the one option of putting your wire through here, versus they have newer styles that have multiple different options, even with this more, the pigtails kind of style post. So again, it's all about playing around with different options and figuring out what's going to work best for you on your farm, and kind of narrowing down your post selection over time. For those with small ruminants, it may also be something like using some of this electric netting as a temporary fence option. Again, this comes in a variety of different options, different heights, different spaces between the wires on the netting, different types of electric wiring in here, different spacings, all different options that you can play around with. But this is very common for some of the small ruminant species that often need a little bit more of a barrier to getting out or getting between different lines of polywire, more so than larger livestock like cattle or sheep. But there's a lot of different options to play around with. So again, I encourage you to kind of try different ones, talk to different people, go to some pasture walks or places where people are actively using these tools, and kind of figure out what options are going to work best for you in terms of posts that you can utilize. So just like we have a lot of options for posts, we also have a lot of options for polywire or temporary fencing to use in conjunction with these posts. So this is just one example of a reel with some polywire on it. You can get these reels that are geared or ungeared. Essentially geared means that for every one time you spin this handle, the reel itself spins 3 times, versus an ungeared reel, for every one time you spin the handle, it spins 1 time. So just a difference in time it takes to reel things up. If you're setting things up and taking things down a lot, can be a little bit of a time saver and less of an arm workout if you have a geared reel. And it also comes with a lot of different polywire options. You can get polywire that's twisted, you can get polywire that's braided, you can get different amounts of metal strands, different types of metal within this polywire. So again, it just comes down to what's going to work best for you and your system. Here we have just kind of a standard polywire with your simple plastic handle. They also make different handle options for these. If you don't want to invest in some of these like geared reels, I've also seen people use things like this, which is essentially one of those extension cord holders from Home Depot or somewhere like that. So that can be another option for a simple thing to hold your polywire. Or they have, this kind of style of thing to also be an option. This is actually poly tape instead of poly wire, a little bit thicker, obviously, a little bit more visible. Some people, mostly in the equine community, like this because it's a little bit more visible, a little bit easier for the animals to maybe see, a little bit more of a visual barrier in addition to being the electric barrier. But those are a little bit more tedious to wind and unwind and take up and down. So the polywire really is kind of one of the most common and most standard options to use in a lot of these temporary grazing systems. And again, you have to figure out what works best for you. And if you have questions, feel free to ask around, see what other people are using, and come take a look at some of the different options for yourself. All right, so I hope this video has given you a good overview of a lot of the different options that we can use when we're implementing different types of grazing systems. We've talked about a lot of different options for grazing management, rotational grazing, strip or frontal grazing, mob grazing, some of the different tools and techniques that we can use to do things like supply water, shade, as animals are moving throughout different grazing systems. And I hope that you remember that, like we said at the beginning, keep your goals and your resources in mind. Remember that not every system is going to work for everybody. Flexibility is really important, and you really need to make sure that you're figuring out what works best for you and for your farm and your operation. If you have questions or you need to follow up or you want to explore this a little bit further, please don't hesitate to reach out to your local extension office or soil conservation district. We have a lot of people on hand who are really ready and willing to help you, whether that's deciding what forages are in your field, exploring options for setting up a grazing system, making improvements in your grazing management. Whatever it might be, we're always happy to help, and we hope we can be of assistance.
This virtual pasture walk is brought to you by the West Virginia Conservation Agency, funded through the NRCS Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative. For similar content, please visit grazingprofessionals.us.